Hello, everyone. In my previous video on Blaise Pascal, I announced a series dedicated to this philosopher. Given the success of that first video, I decided to continue with this theme and offer you a new episode today centered on a very famous concept in Pascal's philosophy, diversion. The term diversion may seem very contemporary and corresponds to what many consider a major characteristic of our modern societies. We live in an era often described as a society of diversion, dominated by television, sports, notably football, leisure, and video games. When discussing modern Western societies, the word diversion often tops the list. For some, diversion is seen as the ultimate modern evil, a phenomenon that distances us from the essentials and our deepest human aspirations. However, in this video, we will explore the idea that the situation may not be as simple as it seems, and that what is called the modern evil might not be so modern after all. To illustrate this, let us recall the Roman adage, bread and circuses. This expression, often mistakenly attributed to Julius Caesar, actually comes from the satirical Juvenal from the 1st century. Bread and circuses describe the political strategy of some Roman emperors to maintain social peace. This leads us to reflect on how, through the ages, diversion has been used as a means of political and social management. The strategy of providing the populace with sustenance and entertainment, summed up by the phrase bread and circuses, aptly represents the dichotomy between the essential and the frivolous, the necessary and the superfluous. This formula appears to be an effective recipe for governing a people and keeping them in a state of docility. It raises a fundamental question. Is diversion an intrinsic element of human essence? Is it an indispensable frivolity, a necessary superfluity? To introduce this topic, I refer to a quote from Pascal, who said, "All of humanity's misfortunes stem from one thing, the inability to sit quietly in a room alone." This statement perfectly encapsulates Pascal's thoughts on diversion and man's intrinsic inability to remain idle. This distress stems from our inability to remain calm, alone with ourselves. In exploring this quote, it is crucial to consider the notion of rest, which directly contrasts with agitation, a theme we have already discussed when talking about Stoicism. For the Stoics, agitation refers to the turmoil of the soul, what we might call unease, literally the absence of tranquility. The absence of serenity, or the lack of soul rest, profoundly marks the human condition. We are naturally prone to agitation, an agitation that is intrinsic to our existence in a world that is in constant motion. The material world, the world of perpetual transformation, is never static. It is always in flux, never immobile. This world of change is also the world in which we live. Since we inhabit such a world, it would be illogical to think that our souls could escape this perpetual dynamic. It is natural that, just as our physical bodies are subject to the law of continual motion, so too should our souls be. As beings endowed with both body and spirit, and given the constant interaction between these two aspects, there is no reason to believe that our bodies would experience movement while our souls would be exempt. Our soul is never at rest, as the human mind is in constant activity. There are always thoughts crossing our minds, and it is extremely rare to achieve a state where the mind is completely empty. For many, the very idea of thinking about nothing is almost inconceivable, if not impossible. When I speak of impossibility, I refer to an almost physical impossibility of completely emptying one's mind. Reaching a state of mental emptiness seems to be a sheer physiological impossibility. This challenge increases especially when the body remains still, as it is often at this time that the mind becomes more active. When our body ceases its activities, the mind takes over. Without physical tasks to perform, our mind begins to reflect, imagine, plan, and dream. It is during these times of physical rest that we engage most actively in mental processes. Conversely, when the body is engaged in activities, especially if they are repetitive and do not require much concentration, our mind may tend to wander. In monotonous or automated work, we do not need to think intensively about what we are doing, allowing our mind to drift and explore other thoughts or ideas. In situations of automatism, or when we are engaged in mechanical tasks, conscious thought becomes superfluous. The mind can then free itself and wander, as it is not necessary to focus our attention on the ongoing action. Whether we are engaged in a mechanical action or inaction, the demands on our thinking capacity are minimized. Thus, whether the body is in motion or at rest, our mind often finds ways to engage or escape, demonstrating its intrinsic ability to seldom remain inactive. When we find ourselves thinking about something else, it's because we do not need to remain conscious of our ongoing actions. This makes us aware of everything else. This inability to immobilize our thought, this constant need to reflect, project, and anticipate, is what Pascal describes as not knowing how to remain at rest. We do not know how to stay at rest because as soon as our body is no longer occupied, our mind looks for something to keep busy. We will explore this idea. Why do we feel the need to occupy our mind? Let's first consider this constant need for movement, this incessant search for a mental occupation. Plato reminds us that the human condition is marked by a sense of lack, by our incompleteness. We are imperfect beings, partly because we are mortal and aware of our mortality. We know that our existence is not eternal and that everything will end one day. Heidegger defines this as existing. Unlike other beings in nature, humans are aware that their life will end, which, according to him, makes all the difference between merely living and truly existing. It is because we exist, and not just live, that our minds do not easily find rest. We exist, and this is precisely why we are often unhappy. Our unhappiness stems from our inability to accept the absurdity of our mortal condition. Why engage in life if, in the end, we are destined to disappear, if everything we know and love will no longer be one day? According to Heidegger, this awareness of mortality profoundly defines the human condition and is the source of our existential anguish, the anguish of disappearing one day. This idea may seem absurd. It is bewildering to think that the purpose of life is to accomplish things that one day will cease to exist for us. Imagining our own end of the world, living through the moment when everything stops for us, requires a deep understanding, not just theoretical, but also physical and emotional, of this inevitable reality. This is why we seek diversion. For Pascal, diversion is not limited to leisure activities or amusement. Reducing diversion to these aspects would be overly simplistic. Etymologically, to divert means to turn away, to steer away from what preoccupies or disturbs the mind. Diversion, in this sense, serves to divert our attention from these troubling thoughts about death and the absurdity of the human condition. In the context of a fork in the road, when you're driving and you take a turn, you depart from the main road onto another path. Similarly, entertainment represents this deviation from pondering our own mortality. It provides a means to sidestep the anxiety of death and temporarily extract ourselves from our existential reality, allowing us to forget that our end is inevitable. Entertainment is a diversion from our usual metaphysical trajectory, enabling us to escape the awareness of our mortal condition. We are beings destined for death, unable to escape our fate. We are aware of this, yet we seek to forget it because constantly bearing this reality would make life unbearable. We cannot bear the idea that our existence is purposeless, that we are advancing on a path leading nowhere. Entertainment thus becomes a means to shield ourselves from this reality, to set aside our mortal destiny. Entertainment can take many forms, from leisure activities to travel, outings, and various pleasures. It's interesting to note that even during leisure periods, we don't solely spend our free time resting physically, but also engage in activities that bring us pleasure and, in turn, help us recuperate mentally. These activities assist us in temporarily setting aside the heavy thoughts of our finitude. It's often observed that our vacations can be physically more exhausting than our work routine. However, we often return from these periods feeling refreshed because it's mentally that we've recuperated. We feel an urgent need to disconnect, to empty our minds, to switch off. This need isn't a weakness. It's profoundly human. It's a necessary breather, a moment to exhale, to divert our minds from their constant burdens, from what we cannot change but must endure. Entertainment, in this context, means turning away from a task that exhausts us to engage in a different activity that may also be challenging, but has the merit of making us forget our usual concerns. Entertainment acts as a temporary relief, offering myriad ways to escape. Whether through hobbies or games, entertainment suspends time. When we play, for instance, we're among the rare moments when we don't think about the passage of time. Not thinking about the passage of time is the only way to stop time, as time only perceptibly passes when we think about it. Ceasing to think about time is thus putting an end to its hold over us. Boredom, for example, arises precisely because we are too aware of the passage of time, lacking sufficient distractions to occupy our minds. As soon as we find something to fully engage in, the idea of time vanishes, along with boredom and monotony. Entertainment, in its many forms, allows us to escape the preoccupation with our mortality. Whether it's leisure or work, each activity can serve as a detour. Work, often perceived as a constraint, is actually an occupation that diverts our minds from the idea of death. Although we complain about the fatigue it generates, many develop a genuine addiction to work. For some, not working is almost akin to dying. They feel useless, fearing they serve no purpose, a sensation similar to that of final disappearance. Being useful, then, becomes a form of entertainment. When we are absorbed in the usefulness of our actions, we don't think about our inevitable end. Having something to do provides a chance not to dwell on death. This is the rest Pascal speaks of, a rest we find unbearable because it leaves our minds without distraction, facing themselves, inevitably leading to contemplation of our finiteness. Thought, when left to itself, converges towards death, engendering deep anxiety. This psychological suffering, related to the anxiety of death, can prove far more unbearable than many physical pains. Living with the anxiety of death is experiencing self-annihilation, witnessing the spectacle of our own disappearance. Faced with such a reality, the often given advice to simply not think about it and live in the present moment loses its meaning. The idea of death cannot be commanded. It imposes itself upon us, uninvited and often unavoidable. Entertainment is essential for warding off the terror of mortality. It serves as our shield against the profound anxiety brought about by the awareness of our finiteness. Thus, work, far from being a mere obligation, transforms into a vital tool of distraction, allowing us to divert our minds from thoughts of death. This battle against boredom, this necessity to keep the mind occupied, protects us from becoming prisoners of a mental cage where every thought leads to suffering. Entertainment prevents us from pondering the ultimate meaning of our existence, from questioning the what's the point of life. It helps us fill the existential void, which for us is synonymous with death itself. It's interesting to note that humans, allergic to silence and emptiness, constantly seek to fill them. This need to occupy every space, to fill every silence, is a reaction to the fear of nothingness, to the fear of our own disappearance. This avoidance of emptiness reflects both the greatness and the misery of the human condition, as Pascal highlighted. Our greatness lies in our consciousness, in our ability to question our origin, our destination, and even the infinite. Man distinguishes himself by his ability to contemplate eternity, to continually transcend. Transcendence is what elevates humanity, defining man's greatness by his ability to rise above the tangible. However, this same greatness is accompanied by profound misery because it inevitably confronts us with our mortality. This duality often casts Pascal in a pessimistic light, perceived as a philosopher obsessed with death, a precursor to Schopenhauer where life oscillates between boredom and suffering. However, reducing Pascal to this pessimistic view would oversimplify his complex thought. Indeed, if human consciousness of transcendence reminds us of our limits and our finitude, it also underscores our urgent need for diversion. As Pascal expressed, even the most powerful among us, including kings, are not exempt from the need for entertainment. This need transcends power, wealth, and status, as none of these attributes can protect us from the anxiety of death or metaphysical suffering. Thus, entertainment is not simply an escape or superficial indulgence. It is a vital necessity, a means to ward off the inherent anxiety of the human condition. Ultimately, no status or material possession can shield us from metaphysical suffering, highlighting that, in this quest for meaning and serenity in the face of our mortality, we are profoundly equal. In the quest for meaning, the simplest minded, those who do not question, seem to find naive happiness, living their lives like automatons. Even kings, with all their splendor and power, are not immune to the need for entertainment. Take the example of the series Camelot, which, while comedic, also subtly depicts the troubled condition of those in power. King Arthur, in particular, is marked by a profound fear of death. This series shows that, Far from being limited to humor, it explores the curse of a king surrounded by incompetence. Faced with depression, Arthur's power only exacerbates his anguish. In moments of profound sadness, he embarks on a quest for his children, seeking reassurance of his continuity through his offspring, a way to seek his immortality. Having children, in this context, appears as an attempt to extend oneself beyond one's own life, to surpass the limits of mortality. It's not that parenthood makes one immortal, but it provides a partial answer to the quest for meaning. Perhaps this quest makes sense, especially when one is no longer alone in asking it, or at least when one is no longer alone in the equation. Arthur, in his despair, when he fails to find his children, even considers ending his life, seeking to accelerate this absurd cycle of existence. Having children might have given Arthur a sense of purpose. It could have been his personal quest for the Holy Grail, a search for the reason to live. Having children means that one often doesn't have time to contemplate one's own mortality. Those who are parents know the difficulty of finding moments of rest, as parenthood is a constant affair, a permanent form of entertainment. Without children, one has the luxury of entertaining oneself differently, of going to nightclubs and drinking until forgetting our human condition. Again, it's a form of seeking oblivion. Without children, one can afford to work 18 hours a day to pursue professional and personal ambitions in which one becomes totally lost. With children, the situation is different. There's no need to seek oblivion or create other concerns. One already has enough. There's no need to invent problems, as inventing problems is often a luxury of those who have the time to do so. Problems can sometimes be beneficial because they divert us from thoughts of death. Pascal said that men love noise, and it's true. When we hear a noise outside while we're at home, we rush to the window. We want to know what's happening because the noise piques our curiosity. It nourishes our mind. We are interested in things that don't directly concern us, simply for the pleasure of being able to talk about them later. Having children might have given Arthur a sense of purpose. It could have been his personal quest for the Holy Grail, a search for the reason to live. Having children means that one often doesn't have time to contemplate one's own mortality. Those who are parents know the difficulty of finding moments of rest, as parenthood is a constant affair, a permanent form of entertainment. Without children, one has the luxury of entertaining oneself differently, of going to nightclubs and drinking until forgetting our human condition. Again, it's a form of seeking oblivion. Without children, one can afford to work 18 hours a day to pursue professional and personal ambitions in which one becomes totally lost. With children, the situation is different. There's no need to seek oblivion or create other concerns. One already has enough. There's no need to invent problems, as inventing problems is often a luxury of those who have the time to do so. Problems can sometimes be beneficial because they divert us from thoughts of death. Pascal said that men love noise, and it's true. When we hear a noise outside while we're at home, we rush to the window. We want to know what's happening because the noise piques our curiosity. It nourishes our mind. We are interested in things that don't directly concern us, simply for the pleasure of being able to talk about them later. For the pleasure of finding something to say and warding off silence, it's crucial to have conversation topics to avoid facing emptiness. When you have children, moments of silence become scarce, and that's when you sometimes realize the need for quiet. Ultimately, it's in the imposed hustle and bustle that we seek rest the most. When the mind is constantly occupied, we long to escape the agitation. But when we're confronted with silence or emptiness, we seek to create noise, to be active. We're even capable of undoing what we've done just for the pleasure of being active. Undoing is yet another way of doing something. All the unhappiness of men comes from one thing: our inability to remain at rest in a room. If we could quietly stay alone with our thoughts, we would realize that many of our actions are motivated by the desire to escape reflection, especially the thought of our own mortality. Montaigne said that to philosophize is to learn to die. It's to learn to accept death not because we desire it or wish to hasten its arrival, but by recognizing it as an inevitability of our condition. Accepting death could make us worthy of life, but on the other hand, it could also undermine our vital impulse, this engine of anxiety that, whether we like it or not, drives us to accomplish great and beautiful things. Every time we act to turn away from the idea of death, we create something. We leave a mark on the world, a trace of our passage. Perhaps our fear of death is simply a fear of fully living. If we aspire to transcend this fear and extend our existence beyond physical death, it's essential to truly begin living. So let's fully engage in life.